Hello and welcome to this Photoshop video. My name's Barry Beckham. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing, and if you hit that notification bell, you'll know whenever I put up a new video. I've been a Photoshop user for many years. I've stayed with that software because it gives me more freedom to create. What I'd like to do here is to just take one of these raw images and process it right the way through Camera Raw and into Photoshop to completion. Here you can see the image we're going to start the process with. This is an untouched raw file and the one I've chosen from a complete set to take through Camera Raw and Photoshop, and what I hope to end up with is something like this. Now it's currently the 24th of March 2020. Now I don't usually date my videos in this way, but we're in unusual times at the moment with this coronavirus. It's keeping very many of us isolated and looking for something to do. So how about a little time travel? Now what I mean by time travel is taking a look back at images I shot years ago to see if I can spot something in them now that I didn't see back then. Now this time travel never lets me down. I always seem to find something, and when we do look back, we're not clouded by our thoughts and feelings at the time. That seems to stimulate ideas and creative thought too. So let's go through a typical Photoshop manipulation where I'm looking to add as much appeal into my image as I possibly can. Now we're all going to make different choices, of course, while we process our images, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now I think I understand exposure pretty well, but as you can see with my thumbnails here in Bridge, I often bracket exposures anyway. I find that allows me to work much faster when I'm shooting, and it gives me options later on in Photoshop. One of those options is to create a high dynamic range image, HDR for short, where we combine all three bracketed exposed images in Camera Raw, but the good thing these days is we can retain the raw status. So HDR is a great technique, made much easier these days in Photoshop, but the nature of the lighting at this particular scene doesn't really require a HDR approach. So my time travel stopped at these particular images. Something made me stop, but my composition isn't brilliant and the foreground bothered me just a bit. Now it's the three images at the top of the page which attracted my attention, this one, and this one, although you can see similar ones to the right. Just for interest here, if I select the first of those and take you to the metadata, if you look at the top left, you've got a couple of little dots there. That's telling us that the exposure in this image was the exposure the camera felt was right. I would be using aperture priority here. In the next shot, you can see that it's got a -1 at the top left, so we're looking here at a shot with one stop less exposure than the camera felt was right. And to the right of that, we've got one which was given one stop more exposure. Now the image I'm going to open up into Camera Raw in a moment is this one, but I feel we could get a result from either one of these two. We could suggest perhaps that this is one of those images which is exposed to the right. When we say exposed to the right, what we mean is we've exposed or grabbed as much light into the sensor as we possibly can, so that we've lightened the shadows but without going too far and burning out highlight detail. But once again, the nature of this particular shot doesn't really require exposing to the right, so I'm going to use this one, and we can open up that into Adobe Camera Raw and make a start. Now you can see as soon as the image opens up large on screen that the composition isn't that brilliant. I've got the horizon almost in the center of the frame. I may have been ready to cut off the base of this image. I can't remember what my thoughts were when I actually shot this because it was about 5 years ago. But as soon as I looked at the image, I liked the recession and the background, but I found the foreground a little bit distracting. The ripples in the water are neither here nor there. So I thought, well, let's add some motion blur. Now the first thing I'd like to take you through is the fact that I always open up my images from Camera Raw into Photoshop as smart objects. To turn that option on, we go down to that hyperlink at the center base of the screen. And the option I want is this one here. Once we turn it on, it will remain ticked until we decide to switch it off. What is a smart object? Well, it gives me the opportunity to make changes to this image, to open that image up into Photoshop. 10 minutes later, when I change my mind or see a blatant error, I can just double click the thumbnail, come back into Camera Raw and make as many changes as I wish. Because I'm working on a raw smart object, I'm not losing any of the quality by making as many changes as I wish or need to make. So I'm going to start in a typical place I always start, with my lens corrections. We'll find them up the center top of this basic screen. Click and open them up. I'm going to tick the box to enable profile corrections. You'll see a little pop as the software recognizes the lens that I used and applies any corrections for the known distortion. But one of the important things is the chromatic aberration. If I click and drag over the top of this image, there you can clearly see chromatic aberration. So if I start to crank up the color in this image, which I'm likely to want to do, that's going to get worse. Come over to the profile section and tick the box. Keep your eye on that little red fringing. Look how effective that is. It works 99 times out of 100. It's very rare that I feel the need to go onto the manual setting and make any changes there. So we're okay there. Let's hit Control 0. A nice shortcut key which will fit the image back on screen both in Adobe Camera Raw and also Photoshop. And I'll go back to the top left of this panel and click back into the Basic tab. Now I find myself attracted to the warm colours in this shot, but maybe there's a little bit of a tendency towards magenta here. So I'm going to streak up to the top left of the screen and select my white balance tool. And once I do that, I'm going to look around for some area of the image that I think should be more or less neutral in colour. So maybe let's try the smoke over here, a little bit of smoke coming up from a bushfire somewhere. And that's done quite a bit for the image, but maybe it's cooled it down a little bit too much. Has it taken enough of the magenta off with the tint? Well, let me hit Control Z, keep your eye on those two sliders, and we can see it's done just about what I need it to do really. So let me go back and redo that. But I did like the temperature being a little bit warmer. So I'm just going to tweak that a little bit more to the right for the moment. Who knows, I may even come back at a later stage and tweak it back. The next thing I'm going to do is take a quick look at noise. I'm going to be blurring the bottom half of this image, so noise is not going to be an issue there. So I'm going to pick up my zoom tool again. I'll right click and choose, let's have a look at 100%. Maybe I'll go to 200%. We can just see a little bit of noise there. There's certainly no problems with this image, but what I may do is go to this option here, the detail, and I may decide just to put a little bit of luminance in there, just to smooth that just a tiny amount, not too much. That looks good. I'm going to stay with that, and remembering that Control 0 fit on screen option, keyboard option, very useful here. Now I've not finished my manipulations here yet, but just to demonstrate the raw smart object status of this image, I'm going to open it up into Photoshop. You'll notice the button down at the bottom left doesn't say Open Image, it says Open Object, because we ticked the box in that hyperlink at the center bottom. So when I click to open, of course it will open in Photoshop. And I'm going to pop my layers out on the right hand side. Down at the bottom right corner we can see a little symbol which is telling us this is a smart object. So I could live with this. I could walk away from my computer now if I wanted to. I could come back tomorrow or next week, and when I double click my thumbnail I'm straight back into Adobe Camera Raw where we left off, and I can make more changes. But you'll notice that now the little button that says Open Object has disappeared because Photoshop always remembers it's been opened. So now any changes we're just going to add them to the file we've already created. So where do I go next? Well, we've done a little bit of work on the noise and we looked to the temperature. I'm going to look at the shadows, the clarity and the vibrance now. Let's take a look at the shadows. I'm just going to bring them up a little bit to try to make the most of that background. I don't think we need to do too much with the whites. We could drop it down. It's going to affect maybe the whites in the top right in the sky, but maybe there's not a great change there. May bring the blacks down just a little bit, down to the clarity and increase that a little bit. You can see everything is quite measured here. I don't think we need too much more. And I want nice healthy slug of vibrance to give my picture a good glow. Now there's a couple of things that are cropping up. Perhaps I could drop the tint down a little more to the left. I'll investigate that in a moment. And I think we need a little more density in the sky, and we can use a graduated filter for that. And I think I'm well past the point where I should have really cropped the image to improve the composition and lose that light base. So let me pick up my crop tool to start with and click and drag. Now you can see the rule of thirds. I'm going to bring this up right to that point. I could go up further, but I quite like that dark area down there. If I wanted to go to that point, these days I wouldn't even worry about leaving this light area in, because I know that I could fix that in Photoshop with Content Aware Fill in just a few seconds. But here things are working in my favor, I think, to bring my crop to that point. When we're working in RAW, of course, once we crop the image like this, nothing is cast in stone. We can always come back and adjust it. Touch the Enter key, so now we know exactly what we're looking at. Let's go immediately to that tint. What I sometimes do when I want to make small adjustments I should say, is to put my cursor in the box, and I use the up and down arrow. So I can make a mental note of -9, and I can start to move it to the left. And you can see when I get to a certain degree, obviously the green is far too heavy. But I know where my starting point was, -9. So I'm going to start going back just to take a little bit more of that magenta off. Not much, and I'm being fussy, I know, but that's how I am. Looking over to the left, it looks a little bit green there. Maybe I'll just come back a little more, and I'll settle on something like that. Next thing I want to do is something with the top in that sky. So I'm going to pick up my graduated filter. I'm going to click and drag down. Actually, that doesn't look too bad straight out of the box, does it? That's a little bit of luck, really. But what I was going to say is, what I often do when I apply these bounding boxes or these selections is to right-click within them and reset them. Then I touch the V key to lose the bounding box. So now I can view the image easily as I make the adjustments I want. So if I want to drop down the exposure a little bit, or I want to increase or decrease the color, clarity, I've got those options. Looking at my image looks a little bit more colorful on the right than it does on the left. I suppose we could do something about that, but my guess is by the time I add a bit of shading on this image, that's not going to be a problem at all. So for the moment I'm going to come back down to the bottom right and click the OK button to open this up into Photoshop. Now you'll notice that we seem to have an odd thing top and bottom. That's because I opened up the image a few moments ago and then I cropped it afterwards. So Photoshop is giving us what I cropped away, but it's giving it to us as a transparent top and bottom. Here's a little tip that I've used quite a number of times. If we pick up the Magic Wand tool here and click into that space, with the option to add one selection to another selected, if I select the bottom as well, I can then select the entire image by inversing the selection. Control-Shift-I is the shortcut, but quite a mouthful, 3 fingers necessary. But if we go to the select here, we can choose inverse. Then we can actually crop from a selection. If we go to image, there's the crop. And that wouldn't have happened had I not opened that up to demonstrate the raw image or raw smart object status to you. I'll hit Control D to remove that, Control 0 to fit the image on screen. So now I'd like to think about adding that motion blur in the foreground. And we're going to notice that Photoshop recognizes the fact that we're working on a smart object here, and it effectively makes what we're about to do much the same as if we was going to use smart filters. I think it's better demonstrated than explained, so let me go up to my filters menu. I'll select blur and motion blur. How much blur we choose is going to be personal to each of us, but it needs to be a bit more than that, I think. It needs to smooth out those ripples nicely, but if you go too far, then it looks a bit over the top. So we've got to find, I think, a nice happy medium, and I think somewhere around 176 there looks okay to me. When I click OK, you can see what I mean over on the right hand side. This option allows us to add blend modes, but we're not interested in those. The good thing here is that we can go to this motion blur link here, double click it, and we can go back in and adjust that motion blur as many times as we wish, because we're working on a smart object. On top of that, we've got a mask. With the mask, we can mask the top part and we can reveal the original background of this image. And of course, we've still got the opportunity to double click this image and open it up back into Adobe Camera Raw. Lots of opportunities when we work with a smart object. So my next tool is to select the gradient tool from around the center of the toolbox over on the left hand side. I need black as my foreground color, and we can mask the top of this image quite easily. So I'm going to go over and select that gradient tool. I've got black as my foreground color. From the options at the top of the screen, I want this one, which is called linear gradient. Generally speaking, a tooltip will pop up, but I think I've got mine turned off at the moment. And in the little box next to it, we want, from the basic tab here, we want foreground to transparent. That's the one in the middle. That's going to allow us to paint onto the mask starting with black and ending transparent. The other thing I may need to do is zoom in a little. So I'm going to use a little shortcut key here, Control and Spacebar. There's the zoom. I'll just click and drag to bring that up a little larger, because I've got to make a gradient across this area, but I want the detail in the top half and I want it to blend nicely into the movement below. So I need to select my mask. There's the little crosshair, so I'm going to hold the Shift key, and the reason I'm doing that is so when I draw the gradient line from top to bottom, it remains perpendicular, and when I release it, I think I've got a pretty good result there. I'll have a much more careful look, but then again, I have used these options quite a bit. Control 0, I've got the best of both worlds. I've got my foreground as I want it, or my top half as I want it, and the bottom half also. Now, earlier on I said the benefits of a smart object was that we can always go back in and make tweaks if we see something later. The top left of the sky, being not quite as colourful as the top right, is bothering me just a little bit, and it's so easy to fix. I'm going to double click the thumbnail, jump back into Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to pick up my gradient tool yet again. There's the original gradient. The pins are turned off at the moment. So I'm going to click and drag over on the left hand side. As you can see, I'm giving it a bit of a slope. Click within the bounding box as I did before, right click and reset, and then touch the V key to lose that. Because if I go over to the right hand side, I think if I just increase the saturation, that may be all I need, maybe just a little exposure with it, but you get the idea. We can balance that up pretty easily. A little bit of clarity maybe over there, that helps a little. And when I'm happy with that, of course I can just click OK. But I keep looking at that magenta cast a little bit now. So I'm going to hit the H key. The H key is the equivalent of going up to the top left and touching the hand. It takes us away from all these sliders which are linked to the graduated tool. And when I do that, I'm just going to tweak this down a little bit more and see if I like it better. Do I? I think I'm just about on the limit. I'm not sure I can get away with very much more than that, and I'm seeing a little bit of green come through, so I think that's about it. But maybe I could choose to take a bit of colour off if I wanted to. You can see the sorts of tweaks we may want to make. Let's open this back up into Photoshop. And of course none of that affects the blur because we're working on a smart object. Now I think there's quite a weakness with this image, and what I'm going to suggest next I think is going to give the image a lot more impact. And there's a number of ways we can do this. While we're working on a smart object, I'm going to suggest that we shade the top, bottom, left and right and the corners. We can do that using the smart object once again. I'm going to double click and open this up. If we pick up the radial filter here, or the circular filter, if we double click you'll find that it fits onto the screen perfectly. That doesn't mean we can't change it. We can tweak it down and we can tweak it in, and we can do the same thing with this as we did before. Right click and reset it, then hit the V key. Because what I want to do here is to have a look at darkening the corners and the edges. Look at the difference that makes. Now we need to come down and maybe look at the feather. If we want to do less feather, you can see how far we can go with this. We could hit the V key again if we felt that we brought this in too much and we wanted it to be. And we can even make the image smaller and drag this shape outside the picture, which is useful at times. There's the V key again. I'll double click the exposure. We can spend some time here and get this just about right, but it makes an enormous difference to the image. It focuses all of our attention into the center. I'm going to click OK to open this up, and of course it goes without saying we should be saving our work regularly as we go along. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes now to save this as a Photoshop file. It's not a bad idea too if we can walk away from an image and come back a couple of hours later or the next day, because we can come back to exactly this point with all the flexibility we currently have. Now at some stage we are likely to want to flatten our smart object and our mask together, bearing in mind we've got it saved as a Photoshop file. So I'm going to go to the top right here and select Flatten Image. Now just one or two tweaks which I could have done in Adobe Camera Raw, but I'm going to go over to my toolbox on the left. I'm going to select my Dodge tool. I've got a nice basic soft edge brush there. If you look up at the top of the screen you can see I've got highlight selected. The exposure is set to 20%. I'm going to drop that down to about 5% using the keys on the keyboard, 0.5. I'm just going to lift the tones in this area, which I think is an important area in my picture, just a little bit. Not right over to the left, but just in that area. And I think I'll also go back to the same options and choose the sponge tool. Again, a basic soft edge brush is what I use most of the time. There we've got the brush set for saturate mode rather than desaturate. A flow of about 11%. Just going to enhance the colour over the same area to draw our attention around that area. Now, wouldn't it be nice if there was a tree sitting just somewhere around there, just a nice little focal point? Well, I think we can grow a tree using Photoshop. I'm going to start by creating a new blank layer down at the bottom right of the layers, and we can put the tree on this. To find the tree, we need to go to Filter and Render. So Filter, Render, Tree. Now that's inappropriate. That is an oak tree, as it says here, and this picture was taken North Queensland, so we're in the tropical area, so the most desirable tree we would need there would be a palm tree. So in this option here, we can go and find one of those. There it is. We get all sorts of options to change the light direction, leaves amount, and one or two other options too, but let's just click OK, because we can make the changes we want right here on this new blank layer. First thing to do is to change the size. Control T brings up our free transform tool. Now we're going to need to make this tree much smaller, and it's got to be the correct size in proportion to what we're looking at. Now I think that's going to be okay, but it may even need to be a little bit smaller. I'm going to hit the Enter key, it's a bit difficult to see, and I'll zoom in just a little bit too. I'm going to move it up a little bit, so I'm going to pick up my Move tool from the top of the toolbox, and I'll use the arrows, I think, nudge it upwards, something like that. But I don't want it to be like that, because you can see how the tree is thicker at the base, so perhaps I should actually bring it down a little bit. And place a layer mask here. Do that from the bottom left there. Now if we pick up our brush, standard soft edge brush, I'm using the square bracket keys to reduce the size of it. Look up at the top, you can see the flow is 10%, opacity is 100. So if I just take a bit of care here, I can just mask that away until we can accept that our tree is just growing out of the distance there. But of course the problem is, as we go back and reselect the image rather than the mask, is that it's lit all wrong. We need a colour that's very similar to our background. So what we can do is flood that tree with colour. Because it's isolated, we can flood just the tree, as long as we lock it first. So I've applied the lock, and if the layers were wider you would see the lock on the right hand side. I'll do it in black first. If I hit Alt Backspace, that will flood my foreground colour. Look over to the bottom of the toolbox on the left and you'll see that it's in black. But you can probably see as well that that colour is a little bit too over the top, bit too obvious. So I'm going to pick up my eyedropper tool from the toolbox, and I'm going to pick a colour similar to what it's growing out from. There you can see it in the foreground of the colour picker on the left. Alt Backspace again. Now it looks much more natural. We can adjust that in a number of ways by making a eyedropper selection from various shades, but I think that works pretty well. It's tiny, but it just gives us that nice focal point. Now we would save our image again, because we've already got it saved as a smart object, so we've got lots of opportunity to come back and experiment with this later. We've also got this in 2 layers, so we can come and change and alter the tree if we see things different in the cold light of the next day. But at some stage, of course, we may want to flatten the image to finish, although I've just spotted a little bit of a problem at the top of my picture. I seem to have a little blemish right along the top there. I feel certain that the spot healing brush will probably deal with that for me. Not entirely sure what that is, but nevertheless they're things that we need to be looking for all of the time, along with any other little spots we may see. But there we have our image. As we look at the finished image, there really wasn't anything difficult here at all. But we did have a plan of more or less knowing exactly where we were heading. It's a bit like satellite navigation in our car. If we don't know where we're going, then the sat-nav is useless. We need to have a goal, somewhere we're heading for. Then, generally speaking, all we need to do from there is to make small changes, because that's all image manipulation is. Generally a series of small changes, none of them significant on their own, but when we add them up, generally it is. As we look at the original untouched image once again, can I remind you that in these coronavirus times where maybe you're looking for something to fill some time, I have a complete Photoshop course online. You can view every single video on YouTube or on YouTube within the pages of my website, but you also get the opportunity to download them all. Can I suggest, if you want to learn how to edit effectively, start with the first video and work your way through as far as you wish to go. Incidentally, when you complete your work in Photoshop, if you want to see it full screen like this, just touch the F key and you scroll through a number of different ways you can view the screen. It's very nice to view the image like this when you've done the work. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.